we actually have the luxury of a fair amount of time for questions. So I'd encourage members of the audience, if they have questions, to come up to the microphone so that everybody can hear. And again, just please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, Richard Gina with Sprint. My question is for Mr. Zussman. So you had referenced the EMP. I've been asked by several customers the impact on the telecommunications network, and I can't find any good studies out there. The data that you have, is it more on electrical infrastructures or on telecommunications networks?
So again, I'm not the US government, but we are funded by a US organization whose job is to look at that. So DTRA is the organization, and they actually have some, I would say, reports that are semi-public. There is one that was made by DOE, and one was reported to the Congress, and I can give you the links later on. And they provide some information. They have a lot of other information that they don't provide us access to.
Are you referencing the National Transmission Grid Study from 2002?
No, something from 2010, 2011.
Okay.
And so, do you know if it was on power or on the communication grid or both?
So the 2008 was on all interdependent systems, gas, water supply, what would EMP do to them? The 2010, I think, was the effect on the power grid of EMP and solar flares. But I can show you the links.
Sure, I'll get you with you afterwards. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Steve Weinstein, retired. I'd like to ask Professor Panwar, Shiv, who I know well. What you described sounds an awful lot like at least an approach to cognitive radio, where you can use any capacity that's available, no matter who owns it. Would you say it's something similar or different, the shared capacity, and how is it going? I know the FCC was very interested in cognitive radio. I don't know how far it's gone.
Right. I'm not an expert on cognitive radio, but in a sense, this is a case where we temporarily turn over the ownership of spectrum and resources in an emergency situation for the common good. I guess that's what I'm proposing, and the fact that it can be done at a relatively low cost because everyone is now on 4G LTE or will soon be on 4G LTE. Clearly, this concept could be extended to other underused parts of the spectrum, in a sense more like cognitive radio. So what I was thinking more is like a standard cell phone can operate in certain spectrum band, and which includes many different carriers owned by different carriers. And the ability of those cell phones and smartphones to connect to multiple carriers could be exploited to create this pooled resource.
Alexis Kosinski, UT Austin. My question is about the last presentation, but it's directed towards regulators actually. Because what we are seeing, even with that application, is that the power issues are now migrating towards the end user. So it's pretty much we are going 100 years back with every telephone has its own battery. And traditionally, the regulation based on, for example, 911 services was that communication companies need to be responsible to provide that service to their end users. Now that we are seeing this, the power responsibility going into the end users, is there anything that is being done or considering to be done in terms of regulatory or regulating that? Or
I can.
The question was to the regulator, not.
Yeah, I won't address it directly, but I'll just highlight some of the difficulties a little bit more that you point out, and I think this is maybe a good point of starting a little bit of discussion on that as well as other topics. One of the difficulties, and this has been pointed out by multiple people, is, and you alluded to that, is that the computing environment in the home has become much more complex than it used to be. It used to be you had at least many people had some understanding of how the phone system worked. Even once cordless phones came about, they still kept one old rotary dial phone somewhere in the attic and plugged that in. And indeed, I was surprised to see recently, I looked at this, that there are now cordless phones that actually allow reverse powering, so where you can actually use the battery that's in the handset to power the base station, the DEC base station for a cordless phone. So that problem, actually, I found that a pretty clever solution. It's a major vendor that all of us have heard of that does that. But the problem you allude to is even if you can get Wi-Fi or gigabit Ethernet connectivity, your laptop is kind of limited to, and your PC won't work, obviously, and your laptop is limited to a few hours of battery power. And then, so the other problem, which I think makes this challenging in terms of an overall system, is that at least in some installations, and you mentioned one large service provider for fiber to the home, is if I look at my own installation, it actually consists of two pieces, namely the ONT and then a MoCA, a coax transmission, which goes to a box which essentially simulates a cable modem type device or a set-top box device, which is connected, which has an Ethernet interface and has the cable coax interface or equivalent video interfaces for video entertainment. And so the problem you now need backup power for both devices because you can't really connect anything, at least in the current mode, to the ONT. That may be changing. And so one of the things that I'm curious about is as to if you look at the total home network infrastructure, just the networking infrastructure, as to do you still see kind of this distributed architecture that was originally, say, the FiOS architecture, or do you see a more combined single unit ONT that's a little bit easier to deal with from a powering perspective?
Well, pure from the powering perspective, and now also from my personal experience in Sandy, I actually would have felt it useful if I could just take the batteries that I got from the CVS and plug it into my ONU, and then use the wireline connection, because the wireline connection is more efficient than the Wi-Fi, and just hook up my PC. I could go to the local Starbucks and recharge my laptop, or I could go to the local school where they provided that. But at home, if just my ONU would be working and I could plug in my Ethernet cable, I would be happy, and I would feel that more as a lifeline than my pod service, because I could communicate with the world. So I think the world is changing, and actually I was, for voice, more relying on my mobile phone than on that fixed line, POTS line.
Yeah, and one concern that we've heard, which obviously been focused on residential to some extent, but it's also a small business problem, that many small businesses rely, say, for accepting credit cards on basic network connectivity, and assuming, now obviously in some cases they can use cellular, but in some cases they can't, because the cellular network is itself not available. And so we had the problem that gas stations were unable to accept anything except cash, and people couldn't get cash because the ATM didn't have power easily. And so that was, again, an unnecessary dependency, it seemed like. So do you know, in terms of industry, but I had the same thoughts on, and I really liked your AA batteries, because what you can do is you can take those and replace them, and many times, as we've seen in Sandy, it's not like you have an outage which spans uniformly 100-mile radius. It is often that areas of power and no power are separated by a mile or two. The same town, like you said, people go to community centers, churches, schools to reach, or their workplace has power and their home doesn't. That's very common. Certainly in the New York metropolitan area, where many of the office buildings, because we have underground power or other facilities, have that. So do you see any activity on the vendor part? When you're itself from one that is not an insignificant supplier of these things, to look at something which is a little bit easier to deal with than trying to, right now, with lead acid battery that I have in my system, I would have no idea, even if I could extract it, how to take it anywhere and charge it. It has a 12-volt plug. There's that's proprietary. There's nothing I can do with it until the power comes back up.
Yeah, you could maybe put it in your car and drive around for a mile or so.
Yeah, if I could,
Yeah, no,
if I could wire up a plug, yes.
Yeah, no, but indeed, as an industry, we take energy efficiency of our equipment very serious. That is the reason why, for instance, we as Alcatel-Lucent and Bell Labs have started the Green Touch initiative, which is in the meantime a consortium of 60 members, among them academia, vendors, operators, looking at the energy efficiency of network equipment. And the reasons are multiple. I mean, operational expenditure is one, but we realized, especially with the event of Sandy, that also power backup is an important criterion. So this is at the research level, green touch, but also in standardization, there's quite a lot of things are happening to set targets for the power consumption of equipment, with also the power backup in mind as a strategy. I just can reference, for instance, the European Code of Conduct has set targets for broadband access equipment that are progressively smaller, so more efficient as the years go through the decade.
Has there been any consideration of, for example, providing, which what we do today is for small devices, we often have a USB kind of a backpack or various other things that you basically have a USB device that has a USB cable for power only, and that you then use to essentially recharge your smartphone or your tablet, and you can then use that device itself has a much larger battery capacity than your mobile device itself, and it is obviously rechargeable anywhere where you can find a USB plug. But it would seem like it wouldn't be that hard to put a USB plug on the ONT, where you can just get one of these devices, and that's even easier in some sense than replacing individual batteries, because you can just get the device that you would normally probably already have for your mobile devices, and you know where to charge it. USB charging is very easy. You don't need to worry about special infrastructure.
So indeed, USB interfaces is already very common in the consumer industry. And we actually have products, or had products, ADSL modems that just operated off a USB. I'm not aware that we have it yet for the optical network unit for fiber to the home. For ADSL, we actually had unit that you could just plug in as a USB into your laptop and charge it from your laptop and have ADSL connectivity. So there are thinking processes in that direction, yes.
I would wonder, since we have a fairly diverse panel up here, I want to also give a panel a chance if they want to comment on one of their co-panelists or ask questions of any of their co-panelists. I certainly want to give that opportunity as well. Otherwise, I'll have plenty of questions. So. Anybody? Yeah. Let me just continue for a moment, and anybody feel free to step up to ask. So you talked about, Biswanath, you talked about network adaptation, adaptability on that. Do you know, beyond your academic type of exploration, whether that is happening at a more systematic level in industry? And I mean, others maybe in the audience even may know whether this type of analysis is actually being performed.
Certainly we have, protection and restoration methods, that are, quite widely deployed in all our, telecom sector. So when, primary path goes down, the backup path kicks in.
Right.
And when the primary is restored, then there's, reverting back to primary or non-reverting, those are the techniques, that exist. And I think in figuring out, diversity of, primary and backup, this notion of shared risk link group, where many links are part of the same, conduit, is taken into account. But this is, on a per operator basis, really, and so, we can have an enterprise, with multiple links that are, maybe going over multiple operators, physical network, but might share, the same facilities. So I think those things aren't quite there yet, and so I think we need to pay attention.
So how do you think that could be facilitated?
So I think the concept of disaster zones and so on, I think should be, given that we have the notion of shared risk groups, which are quite used, so I think those should be expanded to accommodate the disaster zone stuff. And when we have a primary break, we go to the backup, then we already have methods to create backup. So a new backup of the old backup, given that we might have excess capacity lying around, should again be possible to do, and should be done.
James, you want to, since you've looked at somewhat similar problems.
Yeah, one of the problems is that, as you said, this is for a
Go
single
ahead,
provider.
closer to your microphone, maybe.
This is for a single provider. It doesn't help the user if they're multi-homed through multiple providers. So for the providers to cooperate, they would have to share information they're currently unwilling to share, and they would have to export that to users. So we're forging forward, even though the providers may not do it, by adding geolocation to the routing protocols. So we want a user to be able to say, I have a delay-sensitive application, and I want to create 3 paths such that no paths are closer than 100 kilometers apart at any point in time, and I want to erasure code across it so that if I lose any one path, given a particular threat model, I will see no disruption in my service at all. Or maybe it's not delay sensitive, or as delay sensitive, and I have one as a hot standby. But the user ought to be able to express its needs, and then having the routing protocol and the network infrastructure provide that as a service.
So rumor has it that, again, this is basically what people told me, and I can't verify that if you're sufficiently large, General Motors size type of entities, that they have ways to extract that type of geographic information from carriers. Have you heard about, because they have the check that they write to the providers is a little larger than the ones that you and I tend to write them each month. Have you heard that that's is there a willingness at that level to do that?
I once worked with one of the major stock exchanges in New York.
You might want to move a little closer to the microphone.
I once worked with one of the major stock exchanges in New York, and they were very concerned about this notion of sharing a conduit for supposedly diverse lines.
We'd actually talked about it in the CAT, so I remember that.
Yes. And they had to push hard against for their service provider to ensure this diversity, because what they were finding was that whenever these lines were groomed, they used to pop back into the same line, and that was something they had to work with their carrier to ensure it didn't happen.
Okay.
But they had the clout to do
The
it.
Baltimore tunnel fire should have been a wake-up call.
Quick trip.
Debasius Mitra, now in Columbia. Restoration is as old as the Bell system, whatever, it's a long time. I just wonder whether the problems that Sandy and other events like that are drawing up are of a different character, and perhaps the picture of a backhoe cutting a fiber isn't exactly the right model to be thinking about. In which case, things like single failure resiliency, which is the backbone of restoration, no longer applies. So in some sense, you have to go back to the drawing board. And in some sense, you are trying to get this kind of resiliency piggybacking on rather cheap solutions in a way. So a kind of a first level question, just beyond zeroth order, is what is the cost for getting, for capital expenditure, for example, to get the kind of resiliency that you're hoping to have if we have to deal with climate change, for example, in the future. Right? So that kind of cost-driving network planning and disaster resiliency may be a very big question.
Well, so that's why we're looking at areas instead of just individual failures. And yes, it has to be cost constrained. If there are no cost constraints, everything would be a full mesh. So we have a cost model as well that says what's the fixed and variable cost of every link you put in, and you want to get a given service as cheaply as possible.
So I showed, risk-unaware provisioning and risk-aware provisioning. And so when we're looking at the risk-aware provisioning, we're not looking at, the single backhoe cuts of links and so on. So we're looking at, disaster zones, and we're looking at diversity of paths across disaster zones, and even diversity at destination, because, we are looking at, content connectivity, okay?
Would you want to design a network differently? I think the corollary to what you just said is probably yes, that you'd want to go back to the drawing board and design the network to be resilient for these a much larger scale.
Well,
events.
given that you already have a lot of expenses already sunk, question is, can we use the infrastructure better to create better resiliency? So that is where the approaches that I was looking at come in.
Yeah, I'd be interested.
And certainly there's perhaps a little extra capex which we are working on when we talk about risk-aware provisioning versus risk-unaware provisioning. So there'll be somewhat extra capex because you might be taking longer routes and so on to get.
Maybe there's a little bit of wishful thinking here. Of course, it would be wonderful if the network that was designed for simple stuff could just magically work out to be just enough for the larger scale disasters that we're talking about. But perhaps not. Perhaps you might want to think about a redesigned network with an implied substantial capital investment.
Well, in terms of the physical infrastructure, there's a lot of diversity there already. It's just a matter of how you use it. I mean, nobody's got a physical network with a single link through the middle of the country that partitions. You just wouldn't design it that way.
So one of the questions, I think, goes back to, if you look at the network infrastructure, that as far as my understanding goes, is that most of the content these days obviously is hosted in data centers, no longer in corporations, and most of the data centers that are any substance are connected to just about any backbone that happens to be geographically close. That just seems to be the standard mode of operation. So we have, to some extent, for content and applications hosted in major data centers, we already have provider diversity. Obviously, if they go through the same tunnel, that doesn't help a whole lot, but certainly provider diversity. They are not so, what is not quite as clear to me as to how much provider diversity there is on the consumer side. If you have a consumer ISP, and that may well differ between small and medium and larger ISPs, when we have quite a bit of diversity. 80% is probably covered by 12 providers according to some of the metrics we run, but the remaining 20% are covered by 2,000 providers or so. Do we know, or have you seen a notion as to the diversity that from a consumer or small business perspective, you actually get in terms of providers? How many providers do they typically peer with so that you would get, you could benefit from that diversity at the data center level?
How many do, or how many they could?
Well, how many do? They could typically.
Most consumers have 2 or 3 options in theory, right? They've got the old incumbent telco for DSL.
No, I'm not talking about
the cable and the wireless.
Right. No, I'm talking about, let's say, since you generally choose one, you have to be really risk averse to subscribe to both your ILEC and your cable company and pay month after month just in case, when the tree is probably going to hit both of them at the same time if it happens in your area, is that I'm talking more about if you use, let's say, your ILEC, your DSL provider, your fiber to the home provider, fiber to node provider, or your cable provider, as to the number of upstream providers that they have, because that would address some of the diversity, assuming that they have more likely to be physically diverse than a single provider would. Just, for historical reasons, they might have used different rights of way, for example, different fiber lines and so on. Anybody?
I can jump in with something a little bit related. So I think my view on it is that we have been thinking, for example, on diversity at the fiber level, right? I have a disaster here and we'll reroute from there. And the same provider that owns the fiber also owns the IP layer. But from my experience with discussions with those providers, it's not very common that you have really cross-layered restoration algorithms operate, especially for these large-scale geographically correlated failures that operate across all the layers. So even within the same provider, coming up with a solution, let's say I have all the infrastructure that I need, coming up with a solution that will solve both the fiber layer and the logical IP layer is not straightforward. So I think, let's say now you say the provider will choose among 3 of them and everybody will, so the intercooperation along with the cross-layered collaboration think this is several steps away from where we are, at least not for a single fiber cut, but for a large scale.
Okay.
So I'm unaware of the state of practice, for the question that you are asking. But in this regard, locating data centers and then locating content in data centers, including popularity and having a diversity, there we have, interesting problems. It's not, new hardware design, but, it's really, optimizing, locations of data centers and content, so that we have diversity as well as, fast access. Those are important problems.
Okay.
Bob O'Brien, a retired computer scientist, did a lot of work in Wall Street and transit. The thought occurred to me that the industry of telecommunications might learn something from the highway system. After Sandy, the highways were pretty redundant, pretty useful. Some consideration might be given to creating a national network, right? To get towards that, you might want to ask the carriers, how much utilization are they not using? And at least suggest to them that have excess capacity to share it in a memorandum of understanding in the case of outages. And then consider building a national infrastructure similar to the highways. That might be a longer term solution. The other thing is that I don't hear a common tautology about outages and resilience. So you have to get like a common dictionary. That usually precedes any kind of really good work with interrelationships.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to pick up on one additional topic, namely one that Shiv had raised on more of a sharing, at least we'll probably talking more about the wireless side in the last panel, but on the access infrastructure in that. So one of the things that again gets mentioned a fair amount is that different countries seem to have arrived for a variety of reasons, some technical, some economic, some regulatory, on different notion of backbone on backhaul, cellular, and tower infrastructure sharing. For a variety of reasons, when some countries have, as the US tends to have, separate companies that run the tower infrastructure, at least for many of the providers, and other countries have essentially the dominant operator owns the tower and related infrastructure. In some cases, there's mandated infrastructure sharing, and in some cases, there's also different notions of a band plan. There's a notion, LTE, for example, is rumored to have, and I have not counted them, Julie might know that better, somebody said 35 different band plans for LTE in the world.
I'm told by my carrier friends that LTE is not going to be as nice as we would like it to be.
Yeah, so one of the problems, we had the old CDMA, TDMA divide in the old days, which didn't, you had two carriers, they could cooperate all they want if we let them. And if you had a CDMA system and a TDMA system before you had multi-standard devices like you do now, that really didn't mean a whole lot, even if they were in roughly the same spectrum band. So I wonder if you had thought at all about, based on your analysis, as to what factors beyond the willingness of these two models to enter into these two models that you alluded to, how that reflects different choices that different countries have made.
Right, so I think I referred to one of them, is that I believe in Germany and maybe the whole of Europe, they didn't want these ugly base stations all over the countryside. So they encouraged all the carriers to share base stations. And that seems sensible, but in what I presented, actually, the fact that each carrier typically have their own base stations. Now, it may be through a separate company, but from what I understand, if you look at the companies which operate the base station infrastructure in the US, they are all tied to a particular carrier. So there's a quote-unquote Verizon base station company and so on, an AT&T base station company. So that diversity actually may be a good thing in that particular case, because it gives you this diversity and spatial diversity for these cell towers, which may actually help in an emergency. Similarly, I think I alluded to different power sources. So people are talking about battery power, diesel generators, fuel cells, and different carriers may make different choices. And that again may be helpful because during Sandy we had this gas problem, gas shortage. To what extent these policies I think should encourage diversity in some perverse sense rather than mandate something which may appear to be the best at that particular time.
Okay. Unless, we'll do one final question and then we'll take a quick break so we can get back on schedule.
Okay, my name is Albert Vasquez from Parsons Brinckerhoff, and I have a final question to the gentleman from University of California. You mentioned multipath provisioning. So I have a question regarding, so you mentioned provisioning to sort of avoid, provisioning the network to sort of avoid risky areas. So that question is, how would that be coordinated among ISP providers, and also what kind of techniques will allow that to happen?
So if it is the same network service provider, that is providing the 3 paths, that's pretty straightforward. In fact, the customer doesn't even necessarily have to know because, based on the service level agreements, okay, including, under real dire circumstances, how much is guaranteed, we can provide the multiple paths. For enterprises, that might actually lease capacity from multiple different providers. They might themselves, be more proactive in their choice of the paths. Okay, and of course, there has to be path synchronization and so on. And if we talk about SONET, SDH, those things automatically are built in through their next generation versions. And I would imagine similar things will also be available through flow switching and so on.
One more thing. That makes me think about application-aware networks and you may be familiar since it's an Alcatel-Lucent concept, that the network automatically kind of adjusts to certain metrics. So do you think that plays a role in this multipath provisioning?
Yeah, I think so. So, having, more rearrangeability, more reorganizability, exploiting the excess capacity in the network, just because, we have certain SLA, doesn't mean, we have to just stick to that, There are lots of empty seats here, if people want to sleep over 4 chairs, they should be allowed to do that, if it is possible to do so. And then, when more people come, we have to wake them up and say, now it's down to 2 chairs, So, but then, there's the energy efficiency angle as well, right? We shouldn't really be wasting stuff, So if we can, shut off a bunch of chairs and save electricity, but that's a separate topic.
Yep. Okay. I'd like to thank the panel for their contribution, and we'll be resuming at 3 o'clock on time, on schedule, with the last wireless panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.